I heard the scrape of shoes on the porch floorboards before I heard their voices. I had stepped out of my room to check the fuse box light, nothing more, but the sound of low laughter pulled me toward the hallway. The air felt colder near the half-open door, as if the draft carried something I wasn't meant to hear. I took one slow breath as their words sharpened. That's when I heard my nephew say the sentence that stopped everything. "The house will be mine soon." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. The tone wasn't careless or joking. It was steady, almost practiced. His friends fell quiet in the way young men do when someone crosses a line they pretended didn't exist. One of them let out a half-chuckle that didn't land. Another shifted his weight, the sound of his jacket brushing the railing. I stayed still, fingers resting on the wall, trying to understand why those words sounded rehearsed. My nephew spoke again, voice dipped lower now. "I've handled it," he said. "It's just a matter of time." The confidence in his tone settled in my chest, heavier than his words. There was no hesitation, no nervous laugh to soften it. He said it the way a man talks about something already decided. I felt the hairs on my arms rise, not from fear, but from the clarity of what I had just heard. I leaned slightly to see him through the gap. He stood with his hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed, as if planning the future of a house he hadn't built and didn't pay for was an ordinary part of conversation. His friends exchanged looks that weren't surprised enough to be innocent. It felt like this wasn't the first time he'd spoken like this. That realization sank deeper than the sentence itself. One of the boys cleared his throat. "Are you sure about everything?" he asked. The hesitation in his voice told me more than the question. My nephew nodded with a confidence that didn't belong to a 20-something living off odd jobs. "I said it's handled," he replied. Nothing in his tone suggested uncertainty. It was entitlement, plain and solid. My hand tightened on the doorframe. I wanted to step forward, let them know I was there, force the truth out of him on the spot, but my body held still, as if instinct warned me that interrupting this moment would close a door I needed to keep open. I felt my jaw tense while my mind raced through the possibilities he had not yet spoken aloud. A sudden shift of light made him glance toward the hallway. His eyes narrowed for a second, scanning the dim interior. I stepped back just enough to stay hidden, and the wooden floor under me creaked with a sound far too loud in the silence that followed. My nephew stopped speaking altogether. His friends looked at him, waiting for him to pick up the sentence he had dropped, but he didn't. He looked toward the space where I stood, not seeing me, but sensing something. His shoulders stiffened, the easy confidence draining slightly. From his posture, the boys shifted uneasily, their earlier boldness thinning. No one said another word. It was as if the conversation had snapped shut mid-air. I didn't wait for him to investigate. I stepped away from the hallway and moved back toward my room with careful steps, each one chosen to keep the floor quiet. My pulse felt heavier than my body, loud enough that I wondered if they could hear it through the walls. I closed my door without a sound and leaned against it, letting the weight of what I'd heard settle fully. The house felt different now, as if its walls carried a warning I hadn't been listening to. I didn't know what he meant by handled. I didn't know how long he had been speaking about my home, as if it were a prize waiting for him. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty as I stood in the dim light of my room. Danger was already inside the house, and it carried my family's name. The morning light came in pale and thin when I sat by the kitchen window, trying to settle the restlessness in my chest. The house was quiet in the way old homes get, every board carrying its own memory, every draft reminding me how long I had lived here. I traced a finger along the grain of the table I built 40 years ago, steadying myself with the weight of something familiar. Grief had softened over the years, but the emptiness beside me still felt like an open chair. I had built a modest life as a carpenter, one job at a time, and with no children of my own. I once believed the people I trusted would stand by me without reason to take advantage. My nephew began visiting more often after my wife died. At first, it felt like kindness. He brought groceries, fixed the porch light, and stayed for tea even when he looked restless. I told myself he was trying, that he was growing into a man who understood responsibility. His presence filled the house enough to keep the silence from swallowing me whole. I remember thinking how grateful I was that someone in the family cared enough to show up, but small things started to feel slightly off. He once joked that old houses shouldn't stay in old hands forever, laughing in a way that didn't match the words. Another time he said younger owners keep places alive longer, tapping his knuckles against a window frame I had repaired myself. I brushed it off then, assuming youth makes people speak without thinking. Now those small sentences felt sharper, as if they had been rehearsed long before I noticed. Over the past few months, he paid more attention to the house than to me. He would pick up the mail before I reached the door, flipping through the envelopes with a familiarity that wasn't his to claim. He asked about property taxes, offering to handle the paperwork so I wouldn't strain myself. Once, I saw him walking the edge of the backyard, counting steps along the old fence line. He said he was checking for damage, but his eyes tracked the boundary like someone imagining something far beyond repairs. I found myself watching him more carefully during our conversations. When the phone rang, he hovered close, pretending to tidy the counter so he could hear who I was speaking to. If a medical appointment came up, he asked to call the clinic on my behalf, saying he was better with details. His voice was always polite, always warm, but it carried a layer of insistence that pressed against me in ways I didn't want to acknowledge. One afternoon, I caught him opening the drawer where I kept my documents. He slid it shut quickly when he heard my footsteps and gave me a smile that didn't fit his eyes. "Just looking for a pen," he said. There were 3 on the table beside him. I didn't challenge him, but a small knot formed in my stomach, a weight that didn't leave after he drove away. The question that had been quiet at the back of my mind finally surfaced. Why was he so interested in this house now? The roof didn't need replacing, the taxes hadn't changed, and my routines hadn't shifted. Yet he watched everything, as if measuring a future he hadn't earned. I could feel him pushing gently into spaces he had no reason to enter, shaping conversations that led back to ownership, responsibility, or the usefulness of younger hands. That friendly smile he carried so easily began to feel like something else. The longer I thought about it, the more I sensed a thin edge beneath his kindness, a purpose he hadn't spoken but couldn't completely hide. I sat back in my chair, looking at the walls I built, the floors I laid, and the life I had held together with my own 2 hands. For the first time, doubt crept in fully, settling beside me like an unwelcome guest. My nephew showed up the next morning with an easy smile, acting as if the night before had never happened. He stood by the sink peeling an orange, the citrus smell filling the kitchen while he talked about the weather. Then he paused, glanced at me and said, "About what I said yesterday, I was just joking with the guys. You know how young people talk." His tone carried a stiffness he tried to hide. The explanation didn't match his confidence from the porch. It felt patched together, thin at the seams, like he had practiced it on the drive over. An hour later, I stepped outside to check the gate latch and heard him speaking to our neighbor across the yard. His voice was low, but not enough to keep the words from carrying. He said he had big plans once everything lines up, tapping his shoe against the dirt as if marking territory. The neighbor asked what he meant, and he answered, "Just preparing for what's coming." There was no sign of the joke he claimed earlier. I stayed out of sight, letting the contradiction settle in my mind like a small stone rolling into place. When I walked back inside, something on the counter caught my eye. A stack of mail that hadn't been there before sat beside the fruit bowl, and the top envelope had been opened. It had my name printed across the front, clean, sharp lettering that no one had the right to touch. I lifted the flap carefully and slid out the paper. It was a notice about a property value reassessment, the type of letter that comes once every few years. What made my hand stop was the faint smudge along the edge, a fingerprint. His. He must have opened it before I came into the room. I placed the letter down slowly, listening to the silence around me. The house felt different when something was wrong inside it, like the walls leaned in just enough to make me aware of every breath. I stepped back, thinking through the details without letting panic take hold. There was no reason for him to open my mail. No reason for him to look through a document meant only for me. The envelope lay on the counter like a small but undeniable truth. Later that evening, as I passed by the hallway, I heard his voice again. It wasn't loud, but he was speaking quickly, the kind of fast whisper people use when they don't want a conversation overheard. "Yes, I know the timelines," he said. He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. "I'm working on it. Just give me a little more time." His words tightened around something deliberate. He didn't notice me standing near the corner, listening just long enough to catch the shape of a plan he wasn't admitting to. After he hung up, his behavior shifted in small ways that didn't feel natural. He asked if I had taken my medications that morning, though I had never needed reminding. He wanted to know how well I slept, how many times I woke during the night, whether I felt lightheaded or tired. His question sounded caring, but the timing wasn't. They came too often, too pointed, as if he were checking off a list someone else had handed him. I answered calmly every time, keeping my voice steady, letting him believe I wasn't paying attention. But inside, something had changed. The contradictions, the opened mail, the whispers, they were pieces of a picture I didn't yet understand. I moved through the house more carefully, noticing every detail, watching him without letting him see it. For the first time, I understood that staying quiet wasn't weakness. It was the only way to see what he was truly doing. So I made a decision that settled into me with a firm, quiet certainty. I would watch him just as closely as he was watching me. I waited until the house settled into its usual afternoon quiet before I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. The screen's glow sharpened the unease already sitting in my chest. I went through my financial statements one page at a time, something I hadn't done in months. A line of text caught my eye. 3 failed login attempts from a device I didn't recognize. The timestamps were recent, too recent to ignore. I sat back in my chair, letting the details sink in without letting my thoughts run wild. Someone had tried to access accounts I barely touched myself. Later, when my nephew stepped outside to take a call, he left his backpack on the couch. I had no intention of invading his privacy, but a corner of paper sticking out caught my attention. It wasn't a school form or a receipt. The heading was unmistakable. County Property Records Portal, Deed Information. My own parcel number sat printed in bold across the top. The paper was folded neatly, as if he had studied it more than once. I slid it back exactly the way I found it and walked away with a stiffness in my chest. He returned minutes later, adjusting the thermostat on his way to the kitchen. "House feels too cold for you these days," he said, tapping the buttons without asking. I watched the temperature creep upward. He checked the medical reminder magnet on the fridge, straightening it like someone responsible for my health instead of a visitor passing through. The attention didn't feel warm. It felt calculated, like he was shaping a version of me he could use somewhere else. I kept my expression calm as the day went on. When I walked down the hallway, I saw him standing over a drawer I hadn't opened in months. He closed it quickly when he heard me approach and said he was helping tidy things. The drawer held old warranties, spare keys, and papers I didn't need often. Yet he looked through it with a purpose he covered poorly with a smile. I nodded, giving him no reason to suspect I was watching every move. There was a moment later that evening that stayed with me longer than the open drawer. I caught him staring at me as I reached for a glass of water, not with concern, but with a quiet calculation. His eyes followed the way I steadied myself on the counter, not because I was weak, but because the floorboard near the sink had become uneven over the years. He saw fragility where there was none, or perhaps he needed to see it. That was when something inside me shifted. He wasn't just observing my routines, he was assessing me. After dinner, he stepped into the backyard to make another call. His voice was low, but not low enough. "Once it's finalized, everything will move faster," he said. "Just wait. It's close." The words drifted through the open window, sounding more certain than anything he had said to my face. I stayed seated at the table, letting the meaning settle in the spaces he thought I wasn't paying attention to. There was no need for fear to take over, only understanding. His behavior wasn't random. It followed a pattern: financial probing, property research, health monitoring, controlled conversations. Each piece fit with more clarity than I wanted to admit. He was building something carefully, quietly, shaping a version of events where he looked like the one who stepped in for an aging uncle who could no longer manage on his own. I folded my hands on the table and listened to the faint murmur of his voice outside. For the first time, the path ahead wasn't confusing. I could see the shape of his intentions forming like lines drawn slowly on paper. I would not confront him yet. That would close the door on the truth I still needed to uncover. So I made a choice, as steady as the breath I took afterward. I would keep watching, and I would do it with both eyes open. The call came mid-morning while I was tightening a loose hinge on the hallway cabinet. The phone rang with the sharpness of something out of place, and when I answered, a woman from the county office introduced herself in a practiced, polite tone. She said they needed clarification about a request made on my behalf. I stood straighter, pressing the phone closer as she explained. My nephew had contacted their office asking for future ownership documents connected to my property. He had used my name. He had listed himself as the point of contact. My hand tightened around the handset as she asked whether I wanted the paperwork emailed or mailed. I told her I'd never authorized anything. The silence that followed wasn't long, but it carried weight. She apologized, said she would freeze the request until they received direct confirmation from me, then ended the call. I lowered the phone slowly, letting the meaning settle. There was no misunderstanding. He had taken a step I hadn't even imagined. Not a hint, not a question, but a formal attempt to prepare for a future he had decided without me. When he came by that afternoon, he walked in with the same bright ease he always used. I watched him remove his shoes, watched the smile he offered like a shield. I told him about the call in a calm voice. His expression flickered, just a second, barely enough for someone untrained to catch it. But I saw the crack. Then he laughed lightly, brushing it off as a mix-up. "I was just helping with your paperwork," he said. "You always say the government stuff is confusing. I thought I'd make it easier for you." His explanation had the softness of practiced innocence, but underneath it was an impatience he failed to hide. Later, after he left to run an errand, I went to the drawer where he had been digging days earlier. I searched through the folders carefully, one by one, until I found a document tucked behind a stack of outdated insurance forms. My name was printed across the top, bold and unmistakable. Durable power of attorney. It was partially filled out. The signature at the bottom was mine, or rather, someone's attempt at mine. The slope of the letters was wrong, the line weight uneven, but close enough that someone rushing might not question it. My breathing remained steady, but the world around me sharpened. The paper in my hands wasn't a small mistake or a misunderstanding. It was intent. It was control. If filed, it would give him legal power over decisions that belonged to me alone. Property, bank accounts, medical choices. The thought of how close he had come to finishing the form sat cold in my stomach. The next day, his tone shifted even more. He asked if I had considered moving somewhere with more support. He spoke gently, but the words carried pressure, not concern. He mentioned assisted living, as if it were a natural step. He said the house was too big for someone my age, and asked how often I felt dizzy or tired. His questions weren't casual anymore. They were probing, shaping a story he needed others to believe. I nodded through the conversation, offering nothing that would reveal what I knew. If he sensed resistance, he would change tactics. So I let him talk while I studied the restraint in his shoulders, the growing urgency in the way he measured each sentence. Patience wasn't serving him anymore. He wanted progress. That night, I gathered the opened mail, the printed deed record, the forged form, and placed them inside a box beneath my bed, not out of fear, but out of preparation. Evidence wasn't accusation, it was protection. Each item told a truth he hadn't spoken aloud yet. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands steady, mind clear. The smile he always wore had never been kindness, it was cover. And now, for the first time, I could see the danger behind it with perfect clarity. I drove to the city records office the next morning, moving slowly through the parking lot as if each step needed to match the weight of what I might learn. The building felt colder than I remembered, all sharp lines and quiet hallways. I told the clerk my name and asked whether anyone had made requests under it. She typed with practiced efficiency, her eyes narrowing slightly as the screen filled. Then she looked at me with a level, steady expression that carried more information than her words. "There have been several attempts," she said. "More than a few." I asked her to print whatever she could legally show me. She handed over a small stack of papers, clean, official, impossible to misread. The first pages listed repeated requests to access deed history, property tax updates, and eligibility requirements for transfer processing. My nephew had submitted them over weeks, not days. Some had been denied because confirmation from me was required. Others had been flagged for missing documentation. None of them were accidental. I flipped to the next page and felt my stomach tighten. He had told the office that I was preparing the estate for transition. The phrase was printed clearly, not something misunderstood over the phone. It was typed deliberately, entered into a form, and submitted as fact. My signature line was blank, yet the explanation made it sound like I had begun planning for an ending he wanted to arrive sooner than I ever intended. The clerk continued speaking, her tone careful. She said someone had also attempted to pre-fill caretaker information, a step used when elderly individuals appoint someone to assist in legal or financial decisions. She tapped the line with the blunt end of her pen. My nephew's Name sat there without hesitation. Future caretaker, it read. No consent from me, no meeting, no conversation, just his assumption placed into official records like it was already settled. I stood still for a long moment, letting the truth tighten around me with a cold, clean clarity. He wasn't circling the property out of curiosity. He wasn't opening drawers out of habit. He was building a foundation piece by piece, financial access, legal authority, medical oversight. All of it pointed in one direction: control, not after I died, but while I was still alive. Quiet control, the kind people justify by claiming they're helping. When I asked whether any transfer documents had been filed, the clerk shook her head. Not yet, she said, but there were drafts saved under your name. That word, drafts, carried more weight than any signature. Drafts meant preparation. Drafts meant intention. Drafts meant he had mapped a path long before I understood I was standing on it. I left the office with the printed stack tucked inside my coat, feeling the shift inside myself the way a man feels a door lock behind him. There was no pretending anymore, no hoping I had misread the situation. He was moving forward quickly, and the window to protect myself was narrowing. I sat in my car for a minute, listening to the engine hum while my thoughts aligned into a line I could finally see clearly. This was the point where silence stopped being observation and became risk. I drove across town to a small legal office I remembered from years ago. The waiting room smelled faintly of old books and carpet cleaner. When the lawyer asked how he could help, I spoke carefully, presenting only the facts, nothing emotional, nothing speculative. He listened without interrupting, his expression tightening slightly as he read the documents. When he finished, he gave a simple nod that carried the weight of confirmation. I had every reason to be concerned. We scheduled a follow-up meeting. I shook his hand, thanked him quietly, and walked back to my car with a steady breath. I knew then that whatever was coming, my nephew would not stop on his own. And for the first time, I understood the truth fully. This situation had already moved past suspicion. It was escalation now. The lawyer's instructions were simple, but the meaning behind them was not. He told me to secure all my accounts, change every password, and gather every document that mattered. His voice was calm, steady, the way professionals speak when they're trying not to alarm a client. I walked out of his office with a list in my pocket and a quiet resolve forming in my chest. The air outside felt colder than before, as if the world itself had shifted a few degrees toward danger. At home, I sat at my desk and began the work slowly, one account at a time. I changed passwords I hadn't touched in years, choosing combinations even I would need to write down. I logged out of every device, checked for unauthorized access, and removed anything suspicious. Then I organized the papers he had told me to protect, financial records, insurance files, old contracts, and placed the most important ones inside a folder I hid beneath a loose floorboard in the closet. The wood had always been uneven there. Now it served a purpose. By the next day, I knew I needed to test him, not to provoke, but to confirm what I already understood. While he stood near the counter pretending to fix a wobbly drawer, I asked casually, "Do you remember if the county mentioned anything about updating my deed?" The reaction came faster than he realized. His shoulders tensed first, then his eyes darted to the window before returning to me with a forced lightness. "Why are you asking that?" he said. "You don't need to worry about that stuff." His voice shook just enough to reveal the truth. He was afraid I was catching up. From that moment, his behavior sharpened. He hovered in doorways, watching me with a vigilance that didn't match his explanations. If I stood up too quickly, he asked if I was dizzy. If I walked outside to check the garden, he stepped onto the porch to get some air, eyes following every movement. The house felt smaller, the walls closer, as if the space I lived in no longer belonged entirely to me. The atmosphere shifted again a few evenings later. I noticed him glancing at my desk more often, checking what documents I left out, studying the computer screen when he thought I wasn't looking. Something in his restlessness told me he sensed he was losing control. He started talking about future arrangements, with a tone that carried more urgency than care. He asked whether I had thought about long-term options. He said people my age needed to think ahead. His words were soft, but the pressure sat beneath them like a hidden blade. I didn't argue. I didn't challenge. I simply turned on the small recorder the lawyer had recommended and let him speak. Each sentence revealed more than he intended. Each question showed his impatience. He kept circling back to the same topic: transition, planning, support, as if repeating it would make it true. I answered calmly, giving him nothing that could be twisted or misunderstood. At night, the house grew unnaturally still. Even the usual sounds, the ticking clock, the wind against the windows, felt heavier. I walked through each room slowly, checking locks, ensuring nothing had been moved. My awareness grew sharper with every hour. This wasn't fear controlling me. It was preparation. Every detail mattered now. Every shift in his tone, every glance, every hesitation. By the end of the week, I understood something essential. The situation would not resolve on its own. He was pushing toward an outcome he believed he could manage alone. And if I stayed silent much longer, he would reach it. The truth had to be brought into the open, not with anger, not with panic, but with clarity. So, I sat in my chair that evening, hands resting on my knees, feeling the weight of what needed to come next. The storm had not arrived yet, but its steps were already inside the house, and I knew I could not wait for him to make the next move. The moment to bring the truth forward was approaching, quietly, steadily, unavoidable. He waited until the house settled into its late-night stillness before stepping into the living room with a stack of papers in his hand. I had been sitting in my chair, sorting receipts, when he closed the distance between us with a purpose he no longer bothered to hide. The documents trembled slightly in his grip, not from fear, but from urgency. "You need to sign these tonight," he said. His voice carried a hard edge. He no longer softened with charm. He placed the papers on the table in front of me, blocking my view of anything else. I scanned the top page without touching it. It was a transfer authorization, rushed, incomplete, but close enough to be dangerous. He leaned over me, saying it was just routine, something to secure my circumstances. His words spilled out faster than he intended. The practiced calm he used for weeks had thinned. He talked about time running out, about needing certainty, about how long he'd been waiting for things to move. When I didn't reach for the pen he had placed beside the papers, the resentment finally surfaced. "You don't even use half this house," he muttered. "It's wasted. You're wasting it." The air in the room tightened. He stepped closer, blocking the edge of my chair with his leg. I could smell the frustration on him, sharp, unfiltered. He reached for my phone on the side table, saying he would handle the call to confirm the documents. I moved my hand before he could grab it. The shift startled him enough for his expression to crack fully. "Why do you need it right now?" he said. "You don't need to talk to anyone." His voice had slipped into something colder. Then he reached for the small pill organizer beside the lamp, flipping open the lid with a quick flick of his thumb. "You missed a dose," he said, though I hadn't. He held the medication in his palm as if deciding whether I should have it at all. That was the moment I understood how far his desperation had pushed him, not in anger, but in calculation. He believed he had the authority to control every piece of my life already. I stood slowly, not raising my voice, not matching his urgency. I walked to my desk drawer, pulled out a single envelope, and placed it calmly on the table beside the unsigned papers. "Before anything else," I said, "you should see this." He looked confused, then irritated, then cautious. Inside the envelope were printed summaries from the county office, the deed history requests, the caretaker forms, and the notes the lawyer had helped organize. I added the small recorder beside it, still intact with every conversation he thought had, vanished into the air. He stared at the evidence, blinking as if trying to force the pages to rearrange into something harmless. His face tightened, then twitched, then lost its practiced composure altogether. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, voice rising. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." His control slipped away as quickly as his patience. The words coming out of him no longer carried any disguise, only frustration, entitlement, and the fear of losing what he thought was already his. He reached for the papers with a sudden movement, sweeping them off the table in frustration. The sound echoed through the room, louder than either of us expected. That noise carried through the open window and across the yard. A moment later, a knock hit the front door, firm, fast, unmistakably alert. My neighbor's voice called my name, asking if everything was all right. My nephew froze, breathing fast, cornered not by me, but by his own escalation. He backed away from the table, hands shaking in a mixture of anger and realization. When I opened the door, the neighbor stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, taking in the scene with a quick sweep of his eyes. The raised voices had been enough to prompt concern and intervention. My nephew tried to explain, but his words twisted on themselves. His story collapsed under the weight of the documents scattered across the floor. The truth had revealed itself, not through confrontation, but through his own attempt to force control. For the first time in months, the house felt like it belonged to me again. The police arrived before the tension in the room could settle. Their questions were calm, measured, directed first at my nephew and then at me. I handed them the documents from the county office, the forged forms, and the recordings the lawyer advised me to keep. They listened without rushing, their expressions tightening only when they reached the part where he tried to take my phone and medication. My nephew's voice grew frantic as he tried to explain, but the more he spoke, the clearer his intent sounded. The officers asked him to step aside, then guided him toward the door with a firmness that left no room for argument. Fraud, coercion, and attempted exploitation were mentioned quietly between them and recorded in their notes. The next morning, my lawyer handled everything with the precision of someone who had seen cases like mine before. He contacted the county office, filed a formal block on any access requests made under my name, and secured written proof that no documents could move forward without my in-person appearance. At the bank, he presented the evidence of unauthorized login attempts, and the institution reversed every change my nephew had tried to slip through. They added security layers I hadn't known existed, each one requiring identification he would never be able to imitate. Walking out of the office, I felt a quiet steadiness return, like a door had finally been locked properly. Back home, the silence carried a different weight. It wasn't fear anymore, but the space left behind after a storm passes. I sat in the living room with the papers spread out on the table, going through them carefully one last time. Every detail pointed to how methodical he had been, each small act disguised as help, every question shaped like concern. I didn't feel anger rising. What I felt was something heavier, quieter, the understanding that betrayal rarely announces itself. It works in small steps, until one day it stands openly in the room with you. The house needed securing, and I moved through it, room by room. I changed the locks on the front and back doors, tightening each screw with deliberate patience. I sorted the files in my desk drawer and placed the most important ones into the safe the lawyer recommended. I installed a new alarm system, nothing fancy, just enough to mark the boundaries he had blurred. The work steadied me. Every task was a reminder that control belonged to me again. In the afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, letting the quiet settle into something calmer. I thought about all the years I had tried to guide him, the dinners we shared, the small projects we worked on when he was younger. I had believed I was giving him something: skills, support, stability. Instead, he had come to see me as a stepping stone, something to move aside when he needed space for his own ambitions. The realization didn't come with bitterness. It came with clarity. I looked around the house I had built with my own hands, each room tied to decades of work and memory. Nothing about it was perfect, but it was mine. I had survived the slow tightening of someone else's plans, and now I understood the importance of boundaries, not just with strangers, but with family who believed entitlement was the same thing as love. As the light faded across the kitchen floor, I breathed in slowly and let the truth settle fully. I had faced the kind of betrayal most men never see coming, the kind that hides itself behind familiar eyes and easy smiles. But I was still standing, still in my home, still in control. The law had seen the truth, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, the house settled into a quieter rhythm, one that felt more honest than anything I'd lived in for years. I woke each morning with a steadiness I hadn't realized I'd been missing. The danger had passed, but the lesson hadn't. At 71, a man can still misjudge the people he loves. I had ignored the early signs, not because I was blind, but because affection has a way of softening the edges of truth. I had raised my nephew like a son, and in doing so, I convinced myself he could never become the kind of person who looks at an elder and sees opportunity instead of family. As I walked through the rooms, I thought about how entitlement never arrives all at once. It grows quietly, gaining shape through small assumptions. A comment here, a request there, repeated just often enough to sound normal. I realized how easily gradual shifts can turn into something dangerous when they go unchecked. He didn't begin with forged documents or hidden plans. He began with the belief that he deserved more than he earned. When a younger man convinces himself that another person's life will someday belong to him, That belief can twist into something sharp. I spent time securing my life in ways I should have done earlier, not out of fear, but out of respect for myself. I met with the lawyer again, updated my will, set clear instructions for my accounts, and created boundaries that no one could cross without my consent. I filed every important document in places known only to me, and I told the bank precisely who could and could not speak on my behalf. These choices weren't acts of distrust. They were acts of independence, the kind every older person has the right to make. There were moments when the betrayal stung more than the danger, not because I missed him, but because I understood how deeply he had built his plans. When a man reaches my age, he expects honesty from the people he's loved the longest. I had offered him guidance, work, and space at my table. He took those gifts and shaped them into a story where my presence was an obstacle to his future. That truth sat heavy, but not bitter. Some lessons come late, but they still come with clarity. In the kitchen, as I sorted the last of the paperwork, I found myself thinking about others who might face something similar. Age does not make a person helpless, but it can make others think they are. I wished someone had told me, years ago, to protect my independence with the same care I gave to the people around me. I learned that instinct is not just a feeling, it is experience speaking quietly. When something feels off, it usually is. And when small warnings repeat themselves, they are worth listening to, no matter who they come from or who they point to. Healing didn't arrive through forgiveness. It arrived through boundaries, through reclaiming the space that had slowly tightened around me. I didn't need reconciliation to move forward. I needed truth, and I had it now. The house stood firmly in my name, and so did every decision that shaped my life from this moment on. As the sun settled behind the trees outside, I sat in my favorite chair and let the stillness wrap around me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't broken. I was simply older, wiser, and more grounded than before. The world had shown me something hard, but it had also shown me how strong a man can be when he refuses to let someone else write the ending of his story. In the end, the message was simple enough to fit in one breath. Love your family, but never leave your life in someone else's hands.